If you ask anybody, really else, in my opinion, if you say, hey, we want you to come and talk about dinosaurs, this Indian is going to be like, I don't know anything about that. And because like they're not thinking about like if someone else was asked that, like if you guys asked my cousin that, he'd be like, I don't even know anything about dinosaurs. And then like later on, 5 minutes later, we're alone, and I'm like, well, I mean, what about there's all those stories, and remember when Grandpa was talking about those songs, and he's like, well, I mean, those are just stories. Those are just stories. That's not what they want. Those are songs. What they're going to be talking about other stuff, and they do not realize, in my opinion, that these are accounts, and that the prevailing account in the educated world is a mathematical one, and it's the one that we call the Big Bang, and we have to understand that it is an account. It is a story, albeit one told with numbers, but it is just a story. No matter how highly confirmed, no matter how well supported by the data, you can never forget that by looking for counter examples or even ideas, because if you have an alternative theory, whatever it's built on, like, so no matter how crazy the idea, like building up some crazy idea by the Indians, the newer, weaker idea must be supported. It takes time to develop facts. And so then, if this idea of the Big Bang theory really is the idea, the best idea or the correct idea, we don't want to have it standing against straw man arguments. We want to build up these other ideas for the sake of this correct idea, in order for there to be a real competition in whatever, if that is even what can happen. And so the Indians, they in my opinion, I mean, they really don't think about their traditions in that way. They're these social traditions, and they tell them and they participate with them, and it's like all in the context of having a good time. There's a woman named Adrienne Mayer, and she's like, she's in some way working out at a school out west, and she wrote she wrote a book. She wrote a book on Indians and stories that deal with fossils, and then she also wrote a number of other books. And I think that a lot of the bulk of her work tends to float around what people call folklore and stuff and legends. And one of my friends, he's an Indian studies professor down at ASU, and every spring he used to bring me down to ASU, and he teaches a class on dinosaurs. And Adrian's book is one that he uses, and by the time I don't even like her book was published in the early 2000s, I think, and I had already read it a number of years before he asked me to come down first time. And so I think that he had his students read excerpts from the book, if not the full book. And so I one time I Googled her for some reason, and I found out she contributed to this site called Wonders and Marvels, or something like that. And I was going through the results, and then one of these submissions or whatever she had posted had to do with Sioux stories or Lakota stories. And so I was like, oh, that's weird. And so I clicked on it, and she's referring to these different stories, and these stories actually belong to this family, this LaPointe family on Pine Ridge. And like I know some members of his family, and I just immediately recognized these stories as these are like the extended family that these members that I know belong to, like, these are their stories, and they were on this website without any sort of citation or attribution. And so I just emailed her, or I emailed the webmaster or somebody, and I said, these stories are on there, without citation, and I know that it's kind of generally frowned upon when it comes to publication. So I don't know what you guys want to do about that, but I just thought I should let you know. And so then I was really surprised, and then Adrian emailed me back, and I told her, and I was like, I know whose stories these are, and I know the family that they comes from. Aside from your own discipline, probably frowning upon this, like the Indians don't just tell stories that don't belong to them. Like, I know all kinds of stories from other groups, but I mean, I certainly would never try to pass them off without some form of recognition. And she was really really appropriate about it all, and I mean, it wasn't like she offended me, like they weren't my stories, but I mean, she was, she apologized to me, and I was like, oh, she corrected and all that kind of stuff. You have in these museums the chance for technology to begin to play this role in the type of also the stuff that they have. And so you have all of these older Indians, and they have these huge amounts of information, and they really ought to be recorded, and with the idea in mind of different topics. Unfortunately, a lot of the Indians of my generation to about 50 years old, they just don't know the areas of topics which their traditions touch upon. And I mean, they touch upon basically every single academic tradition that is involved in any major you can go into. And so having older Indians recorded and just having those sorts of things available in a digital sort of format at these type of museums was one of the ways that they definitely can change things. That is like the base as far as like what I see digital and media. And I mean, that's a very unimaginative. It's a very unimaginative account. You guys are thinking of like all these other things. Like I'm like uneducated, and you guys know about this stuff, and they're the younger people. They know about stuff. They know about this kind of stuff too to some degree, and they're gonna have much better ideas. But being able to see those things in place where the hardware is there is gonna set the stage for them to engage in whatever they'd like to. And they'll have much better ideas than I ever could. I mean, again, the remarks I'm making are not an effort to lay blame or assign responsibility or anything like that. That is just simply how deeply traumatizing the genocide that occurred here in North America was, and how recent it was. I mean, like, I was like 26. I was 26 when I seen it. It was just a movie. There was this movie called Rabbit Proof Fence, and it was about these Australians and how their kids were stolen. And there was this, I mean, like I know all these family stories from extended family and stuff like that, and I mean, like a lot of the stuff that I know is from my grandfather, who didn't go to boarding school, and he wasn't hidden, but I mean, it just worked out so that he didn't go. And he's also like the from the branch of our family that just didn't have Christianity in their lives. And so I watched this movie, and there's this scene where like these three girls are stolen by like the agent that's rounding up kids. And in the movie, the girls get stolen, and the grandmother, there's some grandmothers, I think it was, and they tried to run, but they're old, tried to run and get these kids, and they couldn't. And so then the guy gets in the car, and right when they know that they're too far, they're not going to catch this vehicle, and they just like drop to the ground, and they're crying, and it's awful. And then I'm crying, it is recent. And I mean, like, even like, I mean, the stuff that happened to us um, 200 years ago, it is told to us in the same way where like um, these first person accounts of these old history of the dinosaurs, of megafauna hunting strategies, it is right there with us. And they talk about the feelings that like because I mean you had a lot of relatives that left and they never came back. They went away to school at 3 years old, 4 years old. They almost all of them were in school for about 25 years and they never knew the names of their parents. All they knew was mother, father. They didn't have last names at the time. They didn't even have uh, anglicized names or English names, and so they're taken away, and then they're taken by train, and I mean all they knew are the villages in their area, and I mean they're transported across days by train, and they get there, and like there's this awful hierarchy of where it's like internalized colonization where someone's pretending to help you and then they're also telling on you and then you are basically forced to beat other people and abuse other people, and I mean you're a damn kid yourself, and there are lots and lots of reasons why Indians who went to boarding schools will never talk about it. They feel that they have become complicit in the abuse, and it is more than they can bear. And a lot of them, I had a grandfather who was an alcoholic, and he's like one of the people that I actually learned how to talk Indian from, because they were raised by their grandparents, and they had an older version of the language, and so it was a really crazy thing, and so they talked really old-fashioned Indian, and they would talk about that though, and this impacts the Indians with the way that they behave, and so you have this trauma that's gone on with Indians, and it is just not something that they have dealt with. It is just not something that they've dealt with, and I mean like the whole larger society, like people that don't even know anything really about it. People are like, I don't know if you guys, I don't know if I'd call that genocide. What I mean? Like everybody is doubting it, and they are not even raising it as genocide. They're just like, this bad stuff happened to us, or like it was messed up what the United States did, and so it is perfect. It makes perfect sense that the ones that did come back and that did retain language. I mean, language is not regarded as an important thing. You get beaten and you get all kinds of other stuff for talking Indian at these schools, and it makes total sense that today the people that are in the positions of influence within mainstream state and public universities in the United States, it does not seem to be a concern. I mean, they're not learning it. They're not learning it. I mean, they're the ones that have the time. They have money. They also have summers off. These are the ideal. I mean, they are among the ideal sets of people, and they are intellectually and mentally engaged. They are among the ideal candidates to learn tribal languages, but it makes perfect sense that they are not. I think that that the tribal nations, that they have to somehow, artists, people like you, I think that artists, there are tribal museums all across the United States, and they often struggle to have shows, galleries, or I don't really know like the different kind of names that they call the things that go along with putting on an art exhibition, different exhibitions, and so for example, like the Indian casinos, you have the Indian casinos, and they all have like a space to like a concert spot, and so you have all these artists from like the 80s, and I don't know, like I don't know, who was your favorite person in the 80s? Who was your group in the 80s?
Talking Heads.
Okay, Talking Heads. There are a lot of the contemporaries of the Talking Heads, and they make their way on this like casino circuit. And the Indians come. The Indians come. They're there buying tickets, and they're there wearing their Talking Heads T-shirts, and they're singing along, and they know all the songs. And in like fashion, there is a huge blossoming art culture among the Indians. Like everybody seems to write poetry. Everybody seems to be making these different expressions using media, and they do not have the environment necessary in order to see that blossom. Be like for example, like me, I'm not making videos. I have like language videos, but I'm not making videos in the sense where it's in their sense. I write, but I mean like I'm not writing, and I mean that's actually like a reason why I do want to begin writing poetry, is because the younger people need to see somebody that's older doing it. It cannot be this weird thing. It cannot feel weird in the community. It cannot be like, okay, yeah, we write this poetry and everybody that's older thinks we're weird for doing it. It cannot be that way. It has to be supported. And it has to be supported in a natural way. And so like, I'd like to write some awkward poetry and read it and have them laugh at me. And it's like, oh, Denny's trying kind of a thing, because that's a real sort of feeling. Like, we've really been doing this like all of our lives. And, Denny just said, he's been writing poetry for the past month, and, he laughs at himself, so it's all right. But you have these sorts of things where you have these tribal casinos, but there are a burgeoning number of tribal museums, and having artist exhibitions come for this like a circuit. I am certain that the tribal museums have it within their budgets to give money to bring these type of things for periods of time. And one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to feed the souls of these young Indians, hopefully Indians of my generation too, but the ones that really need it are the ones that are young. I read this book, and it was called Indigenous Archaeology, American Indian Values, Scientific Facts. And the two were diverged. Values was beliefs. Facts, of course, were facts. And the two were, so like there was this Indian who wrote it, and he was just talking about, this is like, I read this book when I was 18, and it was a very common attitude that I'd seen put forth by non-Indians, and I was really disappointed to see this guy parodying the same thing, where Indians have this beautiful way. He didn't say it like this, but like empirically it reduced to, Indians have this beautiful way of seeing the world, and we can learn a lot from humility and forgiveness and compassion and so on and so on. And then that can temper the type of chauvinism, he didn't use that word, that is present in some scientists or in some scientific research. And it totally ignored, I'm pretty sure he was just unaware, it just totally ignored the information, whether people call it knowledge, whether people call it accounts, whether people call it stories. All of these type of things, the effect that they had upon whatever the Indians had was to reduce it to a set of beliefs. There is basically only one public Indian intellectual that talked about the fact that Indians have information, and that was Vine. That Vine was the only one who talked about that, and that meant that anybody could look at it. It didn't. It wasn't like a lot of people have this idea. Oh, do I gotta be in some religion? Do I gotta have some office in order to know this stuff. That's like, like the first thing that like I would hear when talking with different scientists, and like, oh, I don't get into religion. Like I would say to them, I would like to talk with you about some tribal traditions. Oh, I don't have anything to do with religion. And I would say, what are you talking about religion? What do you mean? And they would catch themselves. Then they'd be like, oh, what did you want to talk about? It was always like, it was really funny. But there is this idea, this practice, this belief that the Indians can tell you about what they think about rain, what they think about the sky, what they think about natural phenomena in the earth. But no matter how much information they have, they cannot tell you about the thing itself. All the information that they have can only tell you about how the Indians think about rain, how the Indians think about the sky, how they think about the buffalo. It cannot tell you about the buffalo. It cannot tell you about the sky. They cannot tell you about dinosaurs. And so, in this way, data isn't meant to be some pejorative term or some debasing term, but one from which Indians can reevaluate their own traditions, and from which other people can begin to appreciate what the Indians have. Of course, that not being the final word. They often have been told for, in some cases, hundreds of years that these are beliefs. And they're just, and that isn't the way that they're even talked about among the Indians themselves. They don't, like when people are taught, when I've heard any of this stuff, nobody's saying this is what we believe. They always, it's like always giving this like vague attribution, like this is what they tell, this is what they say. The way, the spot that Indians are in, like those are all a mere reflection of the concerns that many Indians involved in these sorts of things, when it comes to being in the public sphere, have. And I do not think that the Indians right now are equipped to effectively deal with those things, with those concerns. I do not think that they're effectively equipped to deal with those concerns, primarily because stories, customs, practices, culture is this thing for so many Indians that exists on a PowerPoint slideshow. And there are a lot of Indians that know a great deal of documented and some of undocumented information, and for a lot of them it exists solely in this showcase sort of a way. And so for example, like the older people are the ones, right or wrong, that show you what's important. And so as an undergraduate, the university I went to, none of the Indians there knew how to talk in Indian language, and none of them seemed concerned about that. None of them discussed tribal culture. I mean, like the natural history, like the stuff that we've talked about, is a large bulk. It's its own. It's part of, there's this sphere, and it's a huge part of it. I mean, the stuff that's happened to us here on Earth. It's this huge part of tribal traditions, and I mean, like the base, the natural physical history is the basis for the type of religious or spiritual traditions that we have had. And like they talk about the sun, the moon, and different stuff in the sky and different geographical things on Earth. But then once you go back far enough into the tribe, and I mean everybody understands, okay, the tribe, it's an Earth-based deal. Like comes from our experience here. And then you go back in a certain point in the tribal traditions, and the references are just nowhere to be seen. Where you have like these stories about like the earth living with the moon, I mean the sun living with the moon, about a connection between heaven and earth, a physical connection between heaven and earth. Um, all of these different kinds of, and there's so much more where there those type of references that is just not what we see. And so then it just becomes like this, like in the way that a lot of people might think of like a myth, or myth, and something that which and adhere to, but otherwise intellectually. And that's the way that a lot of Indians understand their traditions. And so then you have them engaged in these different forms of art and different forms of representation, and the interplay of like power and the interplay of influence, and who is in control of how Indians are depicted and their customs and the stuff that they got. And the people that like are to show you what's important, they don't know any, they couldn't talk for 5 minutes about tribal culture. They couldn't talk for 15 seconds in a tribal language. I mean, like, of the Indian professors that I know across the country, easily, actually, on one hand, I think I can count all of them that can talk Indian. There are just so few that are out there. And I mean, that's not their fault. But the point is just that there is nobody showing these young Indians what's important. There's lots of things about knowing economics and the history of and the social relations which have resulted in the conditions that we experience now on reservations and tribal communities that are in urban settings. There are also other things which are important, like language, culture, these type of things. And that is just not what is being shown to that is not what it was shown to be important to 18-year-old Denny, 19-year-old Denny. And not having an environment where there is no place in the United States, there is no center for Indian language anywhere. There is not any place where there's like a girl, a guy, I mean, like a professor, a woman, a man, where this is like regionally or even nationally, this is like this is the Indian that like talks 8 languages, and we have like a center focused around her or him. That does not exist anywhere. And so like, why?